This is a review of Inside Game of Thrones Season 3 and 4. I've done a review on the Season 1 and 2 book and felt that as a behind the scenes look, it didn't really live up to the show. And while for this second volume, C.A. Taylor has replaced producer Bryan Cogman as author, it unfortunately it's a little better. I definitely enjoyed reading this one more than the first volume, but still suffers from a lot of the same problems. But one of the best things that it has retained from the first volume is the absolutely fantastic design of the book. This book feels and looks great. The typography and layout on the pages is very clean, but then it's surrounded by these incredibly intricate medieval sort of looking graphic elements like the borders or the parchment look to the pages, and I really enjoyed all of those little details, especially because none of them ever seemed repetitive. Most seemed pretty unique to each page. And again, like with the first volume, the photos included in this book are excellent, usually really big, really high quality reproductions. But I do have to point out that this book is an even worse offender of using frames taken straight from the show, and that fact would probably really frustrate me if this were a book on any other movie or TV series. But the thing is, because this show is shot so beautifully, the cinematography, the costumes, everything looks so great. And so even though when you're going through 90% of the stuff is screenshots that you've already seen, the choices for the screenshots they've used are still really good, and they look great because the show looks great. And so more so than any other book that I found that is heavily laden with frames from the movie or TV series, even though there wasn't as much behind the scenes photography or concept art or things like that I would have liked, I still really enjoyed the pictures just because you see them and you go, oh, I remember that part. And for such a big, sprawling, complex show like this is actually pretty okay. But other than that, the main disappointment with this book is exactly the same as the problem with the first volume. That is, they're really not offering up a great behind the scenes look at the making of this phenomenal show. I actually had high hopes because the book gets off to a great start when it sort of goes back and picks up on some of the things that were left out of the first volume. It has a great section on the opening credits and the theme music for the opening credits, but then unfortunately it just descended into that same problem I had with the first book, which is most of the text there's just far too much recapping of the story, sometimes by the author, but the worst offenders are, as per usual, the actors. And it's the same thing I hate when you see it on interviews or behind the scenes features, where you basically have an actor or a director or whoever essentially explaining to you something you've already watched and telling you about their character and telling you about how the character feels in that moment, and just reiterating what you've already watched rather than offering any insight into the making of the show. And there's just so much of that. In fact, if you took out all the screenshots from this book and all the text that was recapping character and story elements, the book would probably be about 20 pages long, but it would be a really good 20 pages, because I definitely don't want to suggest there's nothing good about this book, because that's not the case at all. Sometimes this book really shines and shows what it could or should have been. Some of my personal favorite sections where I feel like they really hit the nail on the head in terms of what I wanted to see more of from this book were things like the creation of the direwolves. A lot of the sections on the costuming particularly stood out to me, because those were the sections where you were getting artisans, craftspeople, really giving you a behind the scenes look at the creation of these things, and also a lot of really great close-up photos of the costumes with all these intricate details that you really don't get much of a chance to see when you're watching the show. And I think when behind the scenes books work best is in instances like this, where they're enhancing your appreciation of the show. So the book's kind of ordered in a bit of a weird way, not necessarily bad, but in that it doesn't go episode by episode, but rather it kind of breaks the book into two halves, season 3 and season 4, and then from there it breaks the seasons down into sort of kind of different story arc sections, what's Jon doing, what's happening in Essos, things like that. And then from there kind of breaks it down into like random subjects, which as an approach I kind of liked. So every spread, or sometimes every page, is actually just focused on one particular area. So you aren't necessarily having to, read this book cover to cover to get sort of like a whole picture of how this show was made. Every section was really self-contained and chooses to focus on a particular aspect, whether that's, a particular costume, a particular set, a particular scene, a particular character, things like that. And then the text is usually broken down. So the author, C.A. Taylor, will usually do a little bit of a spiel up the top to set the subject up. And then the rest is, just like with the season 1 and 2 volume, you'll then have text taken from interviews with the cast and crew. And that can actually work really well when you're not having an author reinterpret someone's quote and try and work it into a larger body of text just to hear, from the horse's mouth, as it were. The only downside is that when the quotes are too short, sometimes it occasionally has that sound-bitey kind of feel. Actually, when you consider the approach of the text and the organization of this book, you know what it really feels like? It's kind of like if there were a Game of Thrones magazine, and then at the end of the year they did like a compilation book of some of the best articles from the magazine. That's exactly what this book feels like. Heavy interview focused, seemingly sort of random short form articles on different aspects of the show that they might include in each issue, and then tons of interviews from the cast. That's really what this book feels like to me. So ultimately, kind of like the first book, this book sits in a very sort of funny place for me as a fan of these books and a fan of this show. I guess the best way to describe it is, objectively, I don't think this is a very good behind the scenes book. However, subjectively, as a fan of this show, I still really enjoyed reading it despite its shortcomings, which is why I would absolutely not hesitate to recommend this book to any other fans of the show. Also, for the first volume, they did a collector's edition of the book, but they didn't do one for this volume. I'm not sure why that is. However, there is a box set that contains both books in one slipcase. However, to my knowledge, that doesn't contain any sort of extra or special material beyond the slipcase.